you, David. My name's Rachel, and I'm from the Global Biodata Coalition, where my primary role is to do with the Global Core Biodata Resources. And that's what this webinar is about. Joined on this call by David Carr, also at the Global Biodata Coalition, does all kinds of things. One of them is working on the Global Core Biodata Resources, and he's on this call to help with any questions and provide backup to me and Chuck. Chuck Cook is the Global Biodata Coalition's Program Manager, and we're going to start this session with Chuck giving you the background to the Global Biodata Coalition, a few slides on that, and then I'll take over and talk about the Global Core Biodata Resources and the selection process that you've come to find out about. Thank you. Over to you, Chuck. The slides have disappeared and they're coming
Thank
back.
you. Yeah, I wanted them to see us. There we go. So welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us. Just a bit of housekeeping. We are recording this video. We recorded yesterday's seminars, and we will pick the most pleasing recording and make it available for those of your colleagues who might have missed it. You will be muted throughout, and video thumbnails will be turned off. That is so you can remain anonymous. Please enter questions in the Q&A box, and we'll address them after the main presentation. But use the chat function for administrative issues at any time. Please don't put questions in the chat because we might not see them. So on to the main presentation. So I'm just going to give a very brief overview of the Global Biodata Coalition and why it exists and what we're doing. And then most of the presentation will be with Rachel to explain the GCBR application process. So as all of you no doubt know, life sciences have a very long history of sharing data. We have a couple of examples on the right. Drosophila already in the 1930s, protein sequences and structures in the 1960s. Of course, that was all on paper, and everything has moved online now. Biodata resources archive primary data, and they also provide added value curation and analysis of those primary data, as well as analytical tools. A key feature of biodata resources is that most of them are exchanging data and information with other resources. And I'll talk about more about that in the next slide. And there are thousands of resources, many thousands, and we are currently undertaking an inventory to make an estimate of how many resources there are, or at least a lower bound estimate. Biodata resources form a crucial global infrastructure. Why are they an infrastructure? They are distributed around the world, and as I just mentioned, the data resources are exchanging information, and that's what makes them an infrastructure. They're crucial to the life sciences research effort and also increasingly clinical research around the world. And they are ubiquitously used by researchers, public and private. They're cost effective, of course, because they allow us to reuse data, most of which were generated at fairly high expense, and also to use data in new ways through new analytical pipelines and new tools, and by combining data that were generated separately in different places. A crucial feature of the infrastructure is that it is expanding. More and more data, as you know, are being submitted to resources globally, and new technologies are occasionally or frequently adding new kinds of data to the scientific toolbox, and some of those end up requiring new data resources. The infrastructure itself is under threat in the sense that funding and sustainability are not addressed in an organized fashion. And that's what this slide is about. So the challenges to the infrastructure are, as I just said, demand is increasing. And the demand is both from scientists to use the data and also the demand on the infrastructure to store, manage, and analyze the data for onward use by scientific researchers. Open access policies increase demand by increasing the data submissions. And as I just mentioned, new technologies require new data resources, and that's another a cost to the system. Sustainability is challenging, and a primary reason for that is that funding for the resources is often short-term. Many resources are funded similarly to grants in 3 to 5 year cycles. But as an infrastructure, this may not be the most appropriate way to fund them. They should really be funded on longer term cycles. There isn't too much coordination among funders of these resources. Many resources are funded by large, national and charitable funding organizations. You'll see more of them in a minute. And one thing I might add is that some funders globally aren't really funding resources, so there's room for more funders to join the system and to fund resources. And the last point is that, which I mentioned before, is that the infrastructure is not managed as an infrastructure. So the diagram on the right is just an example of some data we have, which demonstrates the fragility of the funding, the nature of the funding. This is for a set of resources called the Elixir Core Data Resources. In 2018, we asked them how many people they had working for them, how many FTEs they were supporting, and if they got no more funding from the day we asked them, when would they run out of money to support those FTEs, or when? And what you see on the hatched columns on the right-hand side of the diagram is that 3 or 4 years from the date when we asked them, their funding started to drop off. And that exemplifies what I just said about the short-term nature of the funding for these. And there's a real cost to this short-term funding, and that is, first, the managers have to spend a lot of time making sure that they are going to have enough money to support their resource. So they're basically just writing grant applications all the time. But it also means that long-term planning for resources and for the infrastructure as a whole are difficult to make. So this problem was recognized, has been recognized for quite some time by funders, by resource managers, and there's been discussion of it in 2015. A paper was published in Nature describing the challenges of the problem. Some funders and data resource managers got together for a series of meetings, which culminated in 2018 with some seed funding from NIH, NSF, Wellcome, and A-STAR in Singapore, and the formation of the Global Biodata Coalition, which was launched in 2019, and I'll describe in a minute. And there's some other items on there. Scientific program, scientific advisory committee, and executive director were appointed last year. So the GBC is a membership organization. The members, shown on the left, are funders of data resources, and they provide us with a very small amount of money annually as a contribution that supports the Secretariat, which currently has 6 people, but funded at a little bit under 4 FTEs, so it's really not very much money. They join by signing the letter of understanding mentioned on the lower right, which is available on our website if you want to read it. We also have observers who are other funding agencies, which we hope will eventually join, but haven't, usually for reasons of bureaucratic reasons. It sometimes takes quite a while for them to be able to join, but we hope that most of them will join eventually. Our missions or aims are to better coordinate and share approaches for the management and growth of the biodata resource infrastructure, and to stabilize and ensure sustainable financial support for that infrastructure and the data resources within it. and also to select or identify global core biodata resources, which Rachel will describe in much more detail shortly. Our work program at the moment, our scientific work program has two forks. One fork is to describe the infrastructure. One of those is the inventory, which I just mentioned. We will be publishing more on this fairly shortly, next month, we think. It's almost done. The Global Core Biodata Resources, which you'll hear more about starting when Rachel talks. And on the other side, referring to the first aim of knowledge exchange, we have initiated working groups of our funders, the members and observers, to discuss open data and also sustainability. And eventually there will be some white papers coming out of that. And we hope we will also be convening plenary meetings for further discussions with the entire community of resource managers and users of data resources. So that's all on the Global Biodata Coalition. Now I'm going to turn over to Rachel to talk about the GCBR application process.
Well, first of all, thank you, Chuck. First of all, I'll spend a few slides talking about the concept of the Global Core Biodata Resources as the GBC has developed it. These are deposition databases and knowledge bases that are of fundamental importance to the wider biological and life sciences community and the long-term preservation of biological data. They show high levels of usage, scientific quality and service, and they have characteristics such as are listed in the bullet points, providing free and open access to their data. They're used extensively in terms of the number and distribution of their users. They're mature, comprehensive, authoritative, high scientific quality, and provide a professional standard of service delivery. There is an article that I'll probably refer to as the primary paper. The link is there throughout this presentation. We've attempted to give you all the URLs that you might need to go to the source of the things that we're telling you, and these slides will be available afterwards for you to look at. And all this information is also available from the GBC website. Next slide, please, Chuck. So we did the initial round of selection of the Global Core Biodata Resources last year, and you can, and there is a table of the 37 resources that were selected as a consequence of that on the GBC website. We list their name with an indication of their funders, a text overview, and their host country, primary and additional. So if you want to know the sort of thing we're talking about, then that's a good place to go to see more. Global Core Biodata Resources are defined according to a set of indicators. There are many biodata resources that are superb, tip-top, valuable data resources that don't fit in with the definition of the GCBRs, but we've defined the GCBRs for particular purposes to help the GBC achieve the things it wants to do in the goal of reaching long-term sustainability for the biodata resource landscape. Can we have the next slide, please, Chuck? So why are we focusing on the Global Core Biodata Resources? They are in the position that they occupy. They're analogous to keystone species in an ecosystem. The biodata resource network is incredibly well linked to each other. But by identifying these keystone species in these key databases within the infrastructure, we are hoping that the GBC will be able to do work that will protect the entire global infrastructure. The GCBR initiative is only one of the two. The other part is the inventory, which is helping define the rest. These are two axes of working towards resolving the issue that we're tackling here. Next slide, please. So what benefit is there to defining the GCBRs? And there are several benefits, and they affect different stakeholder groups differently. So for example, for researchers who need to find repositories to archive primary data, either because they're good citizens or because their funders and publishers have open data requirements that request that, looking to the GCBRs will provide confidence in the choices that they're making. Funding agencies and science publishers, on the flip side of that, need to be able to help their authors and grantees find the right resources for the things they need to achieve with their data, and having the GCBR list will help with that. Individual funding agencies sometimes have to make decisions between competing applications about data resources, and having a list of GCBRs with the definition that of the factors that lead to that status can be helpful for individual funding agencies making those decisions. There are more benefits. Next slide, please. And then for developing data resources, the GCBRs will be examples of good practice that they can use when they're setting up. Importantly, particularly for the audience on this webinar, data resources that have been defined as GCBRs, that will put you in a community, and the community will provide opportunities for sharing expertise, driving collaboration, potentially developing good practice guidelines, and then the thing that the Global Core Biodata Resource community provides for the GBC is knowledge, information, context of what it's like from the data resource manager point of view, navigating the sustainability issues. It's only having the funders working with the data resources that we're going to be able to be able to successfully develop alternative models to resolve the sustainability problem. And that's a very important plank of the GCBR selection project. And then for everybody, because we have open data as one of the characteristics of the GCBRs, encouraging the GCBR business helps drive moves towards more open data, so that data resources more fully reflect the FAIR principles, which is good for everybody, all stakeholders, all researchers, including private enterprise, for data reuse and discovery. So, and that's great. That's what those are, a list of benefits across the stakeholder spectrum. Next slide, please. So I've described something of what Global Core Biodata Resources are and why we want to do it. How do we know when we're looking at one? There's a profile of indicators that we use to assess whether something is a Global Core Biodata Resource. Those indicators, some of them are quantitative, some of them are qualitative, and the indicators are used to inform a peer review process, and the peer review process brings expert judgment to the consideration of the indicators as a whole. Next slide, please, Chuck. So I'm just going to pause for a moment. The reason that we're having this webinar is to explain to applicants what they need to do to lodge an expression of interest. At the expression of interest level, we'll only be asking for high-level information. We don't ask about all of the indicators that I'm going to now spend a few slides telling you about. But the reason I'm doing that is that everything in the expression of interest relates in some way to this, this system of indicators. So I'll tell you about the indicators, and then I'll move into explicitly what you need to do for your expression of interest. But let's introduce the indicators first. Next slide, please, Chuck. Excuse me. So the first category of indicators is called scientific focus and quality. And this demonstrates a point which is important, and that is some of the indicators are only informational. There's no selection criteria, there's no selection filter based on whether you're a deposition database or a knowledge base, but some of the information that we ask for as we're going through this process is simply informational, because it helps the reviewers understand what kind of thing you are, and therefore that helps understand the data that you supply. We recognize here, of course, that it's possible to be a deposition database as well as a knowledge base. These are just characteristics that are useful for describing biodata resources of the kind that we're talking about. And the scientific focus and quality category is about the inherent scientific quality of the data, the database's uniqueness, comprehensiveness, whether it's recognized authority, whether it's recognized as being part of the long-term preservation of data landscape, asks for information about staff effort. Again, that's not selective, that's informational. And that's the first category of indicators, scientific focus and quality. Let's go to the next one. This is going to be community. Community in several different dimensions. So first of all, how big is the community of users? So within the community category, we are interested in usage data with respect to who's coming to the website. Well, not who's coming to the website, the scale of people coming to the website. And then we ask about usage in research measured through the data resource citation in the scientific literature. So how often is the database being cited? Flipping that on its head, how much do publications that are explicitly about the data resource get cited? We'll also be asking about connections to other data resources. That's the ecosystem aspect. How well embedded in the infrastructure is the data resource? This section of this category of indicators includes global usage, because we are selecting here global core biodata resources. And so one component of the information there is the global usage patterns. Next set, please. The third category of indicators is quality of service. A lot of technical stuff in here. Technical from the point of view of metadata, so identifier use and use of standards. Technical from the point of uptime, response time, backup disaster recovery. Also documentation of several flavors, and data availability information is included within category 3, as is user support via a spectrum of methods. The indicators in category 4, next slide, thank you, are to do with the funding, governance and legal infrastructure. These are all, so funding, provision, governance, legal footing, open data license, privacy and ethics policy considerations, all build up a profile of the maturity, the oversight, and the general solidity of the operation of the biodata resource. And finally, category 5, thanks Chuck, impact stories in terms of how the biodata resource accelerates science, and then how critical it is by asking the counterfactual question: what would happen if the biodata resource, what would be the effect if the biodata resource was to drop out of the ecosystem? So all this, that adds up to 23 indicators, and a list of them with a brief description can be found in the paper where the URL is there, the primary paper, and that's linked again at the end of the presentation. Next slide, please. So we've done the concept of global core biodata resources. We've done a run through of the profile of the information that adds up to the profile of the global core biodata resources. And we're here now because we launched in February the 13th, we launched a selection round, which will run throughout 2023. Further down the news announcement there, we said background information and instructions can be found on the Global Core Biodata Resource webpage and within the primary paper. I want to take this opportunity to say that everything that you need to know is included within that webpage, the associated FAQ and the paper. So that's all there is. You don't need to go and try and find anything else. Everything you need is linkable from these links. Next slide, please. The primary these articles are on Zenodo. The primary paper is there, Global Core Biodata Resources Concept and Selection Process. That is intended to be a comprehensive description of the definition of the GCBRs, as well as components of the selection process and review process. So you will probably find that very useful background. And then there are 2 supplementary data documents. The first is data required for expression of interest, and the second is data required for full application. Those supplementary data documents include all the questions that you will be asked at the expression of interest stage, and if you were to proceed to the full application, at the full application stage. So that means that you can begin now to prepare your answers, which is always nice to get ahead and be prepared so that everything's ready when the application portal goes open. Next slide, please. So selection is a 2-stage process. The expression of interest, why we're here, is a high level, relatively lightweight step. And we're having a two-stage process because the full application requires a great deal more time, and that will be true for the both the applicants and the reviewers. And people that run biodata resources are very busy and don't need to have their time wasted in any way. So we've gone through this two-stage process. We've worked through this two-stage process, and we're using it again today. The expression of interest is in 3 sections, which I'll go through now, and the review committee will decide the applicants on the basis of the expressions of interest, will decide the applicants that will be invited to go forward to the full application stage. Next slide, please. Section 1 of the expression of interest form is a description of the biodata resource, a concise textual description, 200 words, addressing how it falls within scope as a global biodata resource. Then the question about whether it's a deposition database and or a knowledge base. And then an opportunity to describe the consortium context. A great many biodata resources both operate independently and contribute to a larger consortium. If you are one of those biodata resources, then you will need to decide whether to make your application in terms of the individual biodata resource or the consortium, or in fact, both. We have examples of all of those on the Global Core Biodata Resource list on the GBC website. That's a decision entirely up to you. There's no value associated with that strategy. It just helps to understand for the review committee the background for you deciding what the unit of your application will be. Next slide, please. Section 2 is a series of 10 questions, which we call the eligibility criteria. These are questions to which you will answer yes or no. That's all. These are not text questions at all. The questions regard data resource maturity, ability to provide usage data, metadata and standards, data availability governance, and open data policy. You'll recognize that these relate to the indicators that I introduced you in the previous section. And the purpose of the eligibility criteria, going through the process of answering those yes/no questions, is useful for focusing the applicant, your attention on the factors required to qualify for GCBR status. It may be that in going through answering the eligibility criteria, you realize, perhaps because of open data constraints or other things that you are not able to answer yes to, that it's not likely that your biodata resource would be able to go through to the full application stage. That can be very useful because it will help consolidate whether this is a good investment of your time to go through this process. Next slide's got a couple of examples of the eligibility criteria. Is the resource able to provide usage stats covering the scale of users and a statement of the geographic distribution? That's because to qualify as a GCBR, the biodata resource needs to be able to demonstrate global usage beyond the country where it is, and that usage needs to be at scale. So you don't need to give any information, you just need to be able to say whether you're going to be able to provide it or not. EC5, does the resource have a scientific advisory body? That's because a dedicated, independent advisory body will be required for eligibility as part of the mature governance that we request for GCBR status. In the best cases, the biodata resource is transparent about this, and within the about pages or about the project, a user can see what the arrangements for the scientific advisory board are, but it's definitely important that a dedicated independent advisory body that offers constructive, independent input, that is necessary for proceeding to the full application stage. And then a very important one, does the biodata resource have an open data license with no requirement permission from a data access committee or other authority for access to the data within the resource? An open data license will be required for eligibility. I'll take a moment on this one because it's helpful. We've found that it's helpful to be very clear about this. We give these examples, Creative Commons licenses, CC0, CC BY, which are conformant with the open definition. We require for GCBR status that the data resource has a data policy that is conformant with the open definition. We do not require that it specifically employs an open definition license, CC0, CC BY SA. So we need the data to be that open. We need the biodata resource to be that open, but they don't have to specifically use one of those licenses. And that's because, to do with the institutional setting that they're in, they may not be able to do that. But we need open data that is conformant with that standard of open. That brings up another point. We are aware that there are very important biodata resources that necessarily operate data access committees because they have personally identifiable data, clinical data, those sorts of things. The Global Biodata Coalition is committed to finding a way to incorporate those within our operations and shine a light on them as part of the global biodata infrastructure. But in the interests of expediency, as we were getting started in this initial setting up of the GCBR list, that we would keep things simple and work out, probably with the help of the biodata resource managers from the GCBRs, the best way to bring that in to what the GBC is doing. But for now, at this stage, open data is required to move forward to the full application stage. And then next slide, please, Chuck. We will have time for some questions at the end, so that's good. The third section of the expression of interest is the short answer questions. And these are 5 questions relating to the alignment of the data resource with the goals of the GBC. We'll look at them in a minute. The answers to those questions will be assessed by the reviewers and given a score. And the score, well, actually, I'll tell you that in a minute. So let's look at the next slide and I'll just show you what the short answer questions are first. So the first one, you only get 200 words for these, but that's enough. How does the resource serve as a fundamental resource? So you're asked to describe how your biodata resource is important across scientific approaches and disciplines. And that's because a global core biodata resource wouldn't serve a specific project, wouldn't serve a very narrow field of research, because those things would not be fundamental. Second question, how many users access the data resource per day? This is just an indication that we're asking for, an indication of the scale and that the geographic distribution is distributed. The third question, hinting at the counterfactual that at the full application stage you'd be asked about in more detail. What would be the impact if the biodata resource was withdrawn from service? Then a question about the user support. How does the data resource support users? And finally, what management structure and governance measures are in place for the data resource? Each of these is given a value by each of the reviewers, and the value is suitable, probably unsuitable, and unsuitable. So these answers will be graded with one of those 4 values, and that will help build up the review, which the review committee will consider as they put this all together when we get to that stage. Next slide, please. So, in terms of the practicalities, how do I submit an expression of interest? What we're showing here is a screenshot from the bottom of the GCBR Selection 2023 webpage. There's this little bit where there's a direct link to the supplementary data files where questions are phrased. Expression of interest data required there in that rectangle. There's also a link to the frequently asked questions page, which we add to when it becomes clear that a question is being asked frequently. And so if you, it's a funny place to say it, but obviously we're going to give you the email address, you've probably already got it, to send in and ask us a question if you can't find an answer to it. We log those and add to the frequently asked questions as we go along on the basis of our experience. At the bottom there, you can see a rectangular box saying a link to the submission system will be here when applications open. This is true. That is where the link into the submission system will be. The system that we are using is SurveyMonkey Apply, which is as easy to use as, for example, a Google form. And we've had no problems using that, so we'll be employing that again. The link to the submission system will appear there on April the 11th, which is when you can begin to submit your expression of interest, and will stay open until May the 8th. Thank you. I think that's all I need to say about that slide. You will be curious about the review process. It's very similar to that used by funding agencies selecting proposals for research grants. The reviewers are the GBC Scientific Advisory Committee, and they're joined in that task by experts in biodata resource management. You can see a list of the reviewers that we used in the 2022 round of selection on the GBC website, and get an idea of the sort of people that they are. There's a lot of them, and they were very committed to this process running well and putting a huge amount of time and effort, and we're very grateful to them for that. The reviewers do not include the Secretariat, so the three of us on this call have no role in the review process other than to administer it, run it, and coordinate the review committee meetings. So it's two phases. The reviewers are given independently, they're given, and in an isolated way, they're given their specific expressions of interest to review, and then they all get together to look at the compiled reviews and make decisions. The next bit's very important. The reviewers will sign a confidentiality statement and a conflict of interest declaration. We take confidentiality extremely important, extremely seriously. This is a selection process. Although I've said that there are many superb biodata resources out there that are not appropriate for the Global Core Biodata Resource selection process, that they wouldn't attain that status, it's still a sensitive thing for people to apply and not have their biodata resource go through, particularly since we're doing this within the context of a Global Biodata Coalition of research funders. So we take confidentiality extremely seriously. We have not and would never publish anything about a biodata resource that applies but does not attain GCBR status. And so reviewers are asked to sign at the outset and also at points along the way to remind them of the importance of confidentiality. Again, the conflict of interest is very important. The biodata resource community is very interlinked. That means it can be a challenge finding non-conflicted reviewers with the right level of expertise to perform reviews. And I don't mind sharing with you, in the first round of selection, we had to go around 4 times before we got all the expressions of interest appropriately reviewed without conflict of interest. We have, if you read the primary paper, you'll see we have a set of factors which indicate conflict of interest. And then we have a secondary tier of factors which might indicate conflict of interest. The reviewers are asked to sign conflict of interest declaration, A, when they come on board, and B, for every review that they perform during the course of this process, which will run throughout the year. And although we all prefer to have nice interactive webinars where people can see each other and chat, we're holding this one in such a way that your anonymity is protected for those reasons as well. So next, we're almost there. Next slide, please, Chuck. I think it's the timeline. This is on the website, so there's nothing new here. We're now on the second row, webinars. Submission of expressions of interest opens on the 11th of April, deadline 8th of May. You will be reminded, if you start to make an expression of interest in the system and you haven't finished it, you will get reminders saying, look, the deadline's coming. You'll get lots of support in meeting the deadline, but that deadline will be strictly observed. The review committee will be meeting from the 19th to the 23rd of June, and you will be notified of the outcome of your expression of interest on or as soon as possible after the 3rd of July. That's a Monday. So that's the timeline for the expression of interest stage. Next slide, please. If you're invited to go forward to the full application stage, there'll be a round of webinars for those that have been invited to go forward at the end of August. The submission window runs through most of September. You would be, at the full application stage, the reviewer scores and comments are reported back to the submitters so that we can rule out any misunderstandings. That's very important. You get a 2-week opportunity to respond to the comments. And then there'll be a review committee meeting where recommendations for GCBRs to be added to the list will be settled, and that list will go to the GBC board for the decision to be improved at their final board meeting of the year, which is probably going to be somewhere between the 4th and the 13th of December. And then to the next, I think it might be my last slide. Here's a list of references: the primary paper, the supplementary data files, the web page, the FAQ, and then we have a GBC community on Zenodo, and the slides will be deposited there, and links to the slides and a recording will be put on the GCBR 2023 page of the GBC website. And then the final slide. I mentioned we did do this last year, and there is some reading about that. We have the news announcement. Our executive director, Guy Cochrane, wrote a blog. And then we have a summary of the selection process and outcomes in slides for people that like that information in slide form. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you found that useful. I hope I didn't leave any gaps. If any questions come to mind, we'll take them now. I can see there are a few. But if you want to email for any reason, you can email gcbrselection@globalbiodata.org. It looks like an anonymous email address, but David and I monitor that email address, and you'll get responses from us in short order. And for general communications with the GBC, there's info@globalbiodata.org. And again, the people that you're looking at on this call monitor that email address also, and you'll get a personal response from one of the team. Thank you very much. I can see that there's some questions. So I'll take these in order that I can see. We have a question: is being reviewed by a competing biodata resource considered a conflict of interest? The answer to that is yes. That would be a sensitive thing, and where biodata resources are competing in the same sphere, then we would not use reviewers from that circumstance. And then somebody's asked, are the slides going to be made available? Yes, they are, from the GBC website, and we'll try and do that today, but we'll definitely get it done either today or tomorrow. And the links and references are included within the slides, but they're also, when you see the words of, the titles of the papers and everything, they're hyperlinked from the GBC website. You should be able to find everything, but if you get stuck, if you think you thought there was something and you can't find it, do email us, because we'll help you out of that pickle. It's our job to make this as easy as possible for you. We don't have anything where we're trying to eliminate people just because of administrative or difficulty finding the right stuff. We're here to help. And then there's a fascinating question that's come in. Is there an observer status for a GCBR? The easy answer to that, the straightforward answer is no, but it's an interesting question. I think the question is coming from a place where someone has been looking at the membership of the Global Biodata Coalition. And as Chuck explained earlier, and he might want to come in and add to my response here, the Global Biodata Coalition is made up of funders. And there are funders who are members of the Global Biodata Coalition, and they they provide money to help the Secretariat run, or they provide in-kind services. We also have observers of the GBC, again, funders in the broad sense. Those are funders who are interested in what we're doing and want to follow us and want to hear all about it, but for administrative or occasionally governance reasons are unable to contribute directly to the GBC. So that is all at board level. We're talking about membership of the Global Biodata Coalition. The Global Core Biodata Resource initiative is part of the GBC scientific activities. It's one of those activities. And so becoming named on the Global Core Biodata Resource list does provide access to the Global Core Biodata Resource Forum, which is the meeting group of the biodata resource managers of the Global Core Biodata Resources. So you belong to the forum as part of that initiative, but there's no observer status associated with that. In the context of what we're talking about, the observer status is being an observer on the board, and it's funding agencies that have observer status, not biodata resources. I hope that helped answer that question. Somebody has asked, could you please say a bit more on what is the definition of a fundamental resource? By using the word fundamental, the concept that's being got at is that the resource is useful across many different disciplines. It's not restricted to a particular scientific domain. And so it's used broadly through biology and life sciences by many different kinds of people doing many different kinds of things. And is part of the infrastructure, is generally embedded, has exchange relationships with other data resources that are mutually beneficial. There may be dependencies about their data. I don't feel I did a very good job of answering that question. Chuck, would you like to say a bit more?
Well, one thing to say is that this is described in more detail in the documentation, so
Yes.
do read all the papers. Another way of thinking about this is to think of this, the infrastructure, and I mentioned that most of the resources are interchanging data with other resources, so there's a large network. If you think of the network diagram, which we cannot draw, we don't have the information on what the resources are doing, but were we able to collect that information, some resources would be much more connected than others. They would be at the center of a web of connections. So those would be more fundamental resources. So a peripheral resource might be of use to only a few, researchers, and might only have a couple of connections, whereas something that's essential to everyone. A good example would be the nucleotide sequence database, the European Nucleotide Archive, which is already a GCBR. That has, I don't know how many, hundreds, maybe even thousands of interconnections with other data resources. So that's another way of looking at it. It's conceptual. We don't have any data on this, but it's just a way of visualizing it.
I hope that answers your question. But if you would like to follow up with that, I can see in the Q&A. Well, at this point, we've got 9 minutes left, but no open questions. Oh, that's a very interesting question. Now then, somebody has asked, if an application was rejected in the round that we ran last year, can the biodata resource reapply? And the answer is yes. Having said that, the biodata resource application in the last round will have been accompanied by feedback from the reviewers, and the feedback will have explained what the impediments were that prevented the biodata resource being included in the GCBR list. And in making a reapplication, the biodata resource would need to address those things, because we're thinking of this year's round of selection and last year's as the establishment of the GCBR list. We are using exactly the same criteria this time as we did in 2022. In future years, we will perhaps review the criteria in light of what we've learned, in light of the way that time has moved on and techniques have changed. But at the moment, we're using exactly the same criteria, exactly the same systems, because we want the established initial list, which is where we're going to get to by the end of this year, to all have undergone the same selection process, because that's important. So, for example, if the application, I'll just make clear to everybody at this point, I have no idea where this question is coming from or what the biodata resource is. But if the application had got feedback that on greater deliberation, the review committee had decided that actually it wasn't a deposition database or a knowledge base at all, that it was actually a fancy piece of software, so it's a tool rather than a database, then there's very little that could be done about that in a reapplication, because the nature of the data resource is the nature of the data resource. However, if the reviewers felt that the application that had been made last year was in some way unclear, or was lacking in certain information, that they were unable to see what it was that you needed to express, then making a reapplication under those circumstances, if you've been able to address those things. Or, for example, if you've managed to establish a completely open license, if that was the problem, then those things are doable. And so yes, reapplications are welcome, but do take note of the feedback that was given, so that you're using your time well if you decide to go for a reapplication. Five minutes left and no more questions. If you're poised on the brink and not sure, type now. Otherwise, we'll close the webinar and let everyone get on with the rest of their day. So thank you very much, everyone, for attending. It's been lovely to be able to tell you about this. We hope you found it useful, and we hope if you have any questions, you'll get in touch. And thank you very much for giving us your time today.